Hello and welcome to a series I'd like to call The Professional Insider, a weekly podcast where I talk to people in particular and perhaps peculiar professions, getting a glimpse into their work and into their lives. I'm your host, Helen Tesjanla. Today's profession concerns music therapy, a perhaps underrepresented practice that provides help to not only a range of people, from babies to elderly people, but also to those who cannot use therapies that rely on verbal forms of communication. Today's expert is Clare Maddocks, the PR officer for the British Association for Music Therapy. Just to sort of start off with, I think it'd be quite useful if you could tell me a bit about yourself, about you and your background and how you really got into music therapy.
Yeah, sure. So my background was that I did an undergraduate in music. As part of the training that I did was in community music and getting trained up to go into hospital wards and basically do interactive music sessions in lots of different hospital wards. So mostly kind of adult stroke units or maybe pediatric units. And I continued that work after I finished my undergrad. And what I really noticed doing the stroke work was this kind of really interesting thing where I would go into a stroke ward and a lot of the patients couldn't speak because of, post-stroke, having communication difficulties. But I noticed that lots and lots of them could sing. And I was utterly fascinated by this. And it kind of started me on this kind of journey towards music therapy because I just wanted to find out more. So a few years later, I studied my MA in music therapy at the University of the West of England, which is based in Bristol. And that was a 3-year part-time course. So I finished that in 2018. And I've been just qualified since then, working with lots of different client groups. And I've also undergone further training in neurologic music therapy. So that's a sort of specialism training, which is really informed by neuroscience and is about using very functional, specific techniques to help. It's predominantly for people with brain injuries, but can be used for people who have other kind of neurological conditions as well. And that's really focusing on, like I say, just very functional outcomes. So it might be thinking about speech, it might be thinking about helping people walk again or upper limb movement, just lots of different things. And then obviously on top of that, I do PR for the BAMT.
So I'm sure you've come across this perhaps in like your PR aspect of your career. How would you describe music therapy to someone who hasn't heard it before? If you could sort of summarize it up, I'm not saying necessarily in a sentence because I'm pretty sure for most professions that's quite hard. So if you could sort of round it up in some sort of way, how would you explain it?
So the sort of definition that we provide at BAMT is that it's a clinical psychological intervention, that it uses music in all its forms, and we use music to help support people with all the different needs they have. Those could be cognitive, they could be emotional, psychological, they could be physiological. But I appreciate there's a bit of a what does that actually mean and what does it kind of sound like? So when I'm working with people who literally don't know anything about, even just about the therapy world, what I say is, if you think about verbal counselling and you think about that you go to that space to have someone support you and talk to you and just help you process kind of what's going on for you, we do that, but instead of only using words, we use music as well. So we take away that need for words, and it means that we're accessible to people who maybe can't speak, who are non-verbal, but it also means that actually if having that conversation is really difficult, then we are professionals who can still help you process and work through that without that kind of pressure to put it into a conversation.
Where, from your knowledge, where did music therapy really come from? Was it a recognition by people that there were sections in society that found it difficult to communicate or that couldn't verbally communicate, and therefore they needed avenues to express how they feel, what they were going through by alternative means?
Well, it's actually, history is really interesting. So it actually started off as basically like music in hospitals. So it was mostly around kind of the 1950s. And what happened was obviously there was still a lot of admissions that were related to the war. And what doctors noticed was that if they got musicians in, they noticed that the heart rates of the patients changed, and they noticed that their demeanour changed. And so they started to see, we know so much more about that now. We know, that music can influence your sort of systolic blood pressure and your heart rate and all these different things. But obviously then nobody knew anything about that. So they literally just kind of were watching their patients and could see these differences. And that's what kind of started the interest. And then from there, basically, there was just some fantastic musicians who became pioneers. So people that you might have heard of Nordhoff and Robbins. Nordhoff Robbins is still a huge charity. It's actually the biggest music therapy charity in the UK. So they were musicians, and what they did is that they got together and they started doing music and improvising music with young children with additional support needs. And again, this was at a time where, there was a lot of stigma around disability. And I know there still is now, but, much more so then. And a lot of people thinking that these young children weren't kind of going to grow up into anything and couldn't access anything. And here were these two musicians playing music with them and saying, well, look, this child's actually interacting with me now. This autistic child is trying to connect with me. And from there, it basically became this sort of stream of other pioneers who just sort of picked up on this, and then it just gradually developed into the intervention and the training that exists in the UK today. So it's a really interesting, varied history.
But do you think that music therapy is quite popular in, or recognised even in, other countries? As far as I can tell, it's quite recognised in the UK. As far as I know, there's around 800 registered music therapists in the UK. So obviously that's a lot of people. But in other countries, perhaps even smaller countries, is it really a profession that's recognised?
So the answer is really different depending on what country you're thinking of. And you're right, we've kind of got a good number in the UK. I think we're actually kind of closer to 1,000. I know at BAMT we've got at least 900 UK members.
Wow.
But obviously you don't have to register with BAMT. It's, whereas we are registered with HCPC. So there's definitely there's a very big recognition for it in the US. And what's interesting is that in general, the population of the US seem a little bit more informed about music therapy than the public does in the UK. And I think there's lots of different reasons for that. But certainly in terms of like the neurologic side, that's something that's been recognised much, much more. And the setup of neurologic music therapists in American healthcare systems is much better established in some ways than it is in the UK. We're still kind of having to fight the fight a little bit in some places. We're getting there. We are getting there. But yeah, we're still a profession that we do have to kind of fly the flag for a little bit and educate kind of people in healthcare systems. If you go sort of across Europe, it's a really, really varied picture there. So you do have countries within Europe that have a much greater, again, kind of arts and health recognition than perhaps we do in the UK. As you go further afield, I think it gets a little bit more challenging. I know that we have a lot of international students in the UK who come and study music therapy and who take it back to their home countries. So that's really mixed from sort of students from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, from all over Malaysia and India and Pakistan. The impression I get, I'm not as informed on that. The impression I get there is that in some places they're very open to it, but there's still a real cultural stigma around the word therapy, and that is something that we do see in the UK and in the US as well. Is that there is still a lot of education to be done because some people hear the word therapy and see it's this very negative thing, whereas actually I think the younger generation are doing a lot for reducing that stigma in the UK now, because we do talk about it much more and it's much more normal for people to just be open and accept. I have friends who talk about going to therapy. It's part of the conversation, but that's not present in all cultures yet. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but it's a very varied picture depending on where you are.
I think it's probably a bit unfair for me to say globally, what do you think? But sort of honing in on the UK a little bit more. I mean, we spoke a bit over the phone about perhaps misconceptions from the public about them hearing perhaps. The reason why I'm clarifying is because they wouldn't have heard the conversation on the phone, but there's almost that reaction, and quite a normal reaction, to think of music and therapy being quite separate things. Do you think that that's possibly why, or do you disagree? Please tell me. if the public maybe aren't as informed about music therapy, that they just can't conceive the idea that music and therapy actually coincide quite well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is just, there's a stigma still to the word therapy. And I honestly think that's one of the biggest barriers. And then people can't really work out, when you say the word therapy, often a lot of people think that, you lie down on a couch and you get asked questions about your mother. And even though that is such an old image, that comes from such a long time ago, that image and impression is still quite fresh in people's minds. And so then I think people then think that we get people to sit down on a couch and we bring out like a violin and a guitar and we just, we play to them. There's this strange kind of imagery that goes on. So I think a lot of it is really to do that there is still that stigma around the word therapy. But I think it's also that we have so much music in our society, and it's, we have music in the streets. If you go shopping, you hear buskers. If you go into schools, they do lots of music there. If you go into different bars and clubs and things like that, obviously pre-COVID, we have such a large kind of live music scene, and it's been really growing in hospitals and healthcare settings as well. And there's been fantastic kind of evidence and things in the media about, people going into care homes and doing music there. And I think there's just this slight misunderstanding of what the difference is between that kind of community music, which is really valuable and important and has its place, and between what a music therapist does. Because from the outside looking in, it can look really similar. If you go into a care home and one day there's a community musician sitting in a corner with a guitar singing to someone, and the next day you go in and it's a music therapist and they've got a guitar and they're singing to someone, understandably, you're going to think it's kind of the same thing. And that is kind of a misconception that we're really trying to address and break down. But it's just really about education, I think, and just in people sort of doing their research, but also in us at the BAMT to try and promote it much more and as much as we can in all these different communities and in all these different areas, to just really highlight what the difference is, and also to help signpost people, because not everyone needs a music therapist. But if you do need a music therapist, then it's about kind of knowing where to go and how to approach that. And vice versa. Some people might think, actually, I just need a community music group, but then, they find that actually that's not meeting all their needs. So maybe having that specialist input from a therapist could be beneficial. It's about kind of finding what's right for the person as well.
Do you think that, in a way, the flip side of that, so we've discussed sort of the misconceptions, almost the cons surrounding music therapy, do you think that the pros almost are the fact that it's such a bespoke type of therapy that really allows people, as we said before, to communicate? It's a valuable thing. I think that although that there's a misconception with people and surrounding music therapy, we've always known that it's not just music playing in our ear and then coming out the other, that it has an effect on us. You might have come across this with your studies of neurological music therapy. It does things to our brains, and in a way, surely that's something that we've always known. So isn't it valuable in that sense? Is that not the main benefit from music therapy?
Yeah, I think there's so many. And I think you're right. Looking at kind of the evidence of sort of the impact it has on us physiologically and emotionally is really important. But it's also important to stress that actually the relationship in music therapy is really key. That relationship that you have with your therapist is really key. And, it's kind of the same for all types of therapy, but a lot of what happens in music therapy is really about the kind of interactions between you and your therapist in the music and what is kind of happening there and how they're supporting you. But you're right. And I think something that a lot of people don't really realise with music therapy is that we work with people throughout the entire lifespan. As I sort of told you on the phone, we've got music therapists in the UK working with families and young babies in neonatal units, literally throughout, all the way to elderly care and palliative care. We've got them in adult mental health units, we've got them in schools and additional support needs schools as well. We've got them in mainstream adolescent education, we've got them in pupil referral units, in prisons, in juvenile centre. You kind of name it, and there's a music therapist in the UK somewhere working in those areas. So I think that just shows you how versatile it is. And it's just one of these things that music is so universal, and you don't have to be musical to access music therapy. Like, we are naturally kind of musical beings, as you've kind of pointed out. You know, we know that when we listen to music, you know, our bodies react to it. And we know that when we listen to familiar music, that assigns kind of memories to it, which is why when people with dementia hear songs from their childhood, even though they might not be able to speak if they're in the advanced stages, they'll often be able to sing along, or they'll have memories associated with that. You know, our brains are these just kind of fantastic things that can do all sorts of incredible things. And, you know, we know that music accesses, you know, pretty much all the areas of our brains in some way, whereas other functions, perhaps like speech and things like that, it's more specific to particular regions of the brain. But when you look at someone listening to music in an MRI scanner, their brain literally just kind of lights up. So that's why with sort of brain injury and all these different communities that we work with, we find that like music can just bypass, you know, barriers that you might have when you're trying to access verbal therapy or other types of therapy. So I think it's just really important to know that, you know, there's just so much to it, and it's worth exploring, and it's worth just thinking about how do you use music in your day-to-day life, because we all do to some degree, I think, use it on some therapeutic level. So I guess it's just about thinking, how do you use it already, and how could it, you know, is that something that could help you? Because again, like we said before, it removes that pressure for words. So again, it makes it so accessible in so many other ways as well.
If you, from your position now, from what you know, what you've studied, what would you change about music therapy and how it's introduced to people and how it's advertised, for example, how it's funded, how would you get it out to fight the fight, like you were saying earlier, and educate people? What would you do to change that?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think there's different layers to it. Part of me would think go straight to the top and really get it recognised, because we are allied health professionals. So that means that because of the specialist training that we've done, we're in the same professional field as physiotherapists, speech and language therapists, OTs, and all these other allied health professions. Yet we're often not given the same recognition as those colleagues. So for me, that's a real issue in actually the education of our profession as a whole, within those kind of higher streams of the healthcare system, within the higher streams of, you know, like mental health systems that we have in place in this country, local authorities who provide services to schools and things like that. I think there needs to be, for me, I would love to just kind of do a massive kind of overhaul of that and just have us kind of treated the same as those professions, because unfortunately we're not. In some areas we are, but it's such a kind of lottery, and it really depends on who's in that management level and what they understand music therapy to be. So for me, there's a big thing about that, and it would be great to have more sort of maybe national campaigns and things like that. But I think it also has to work on a really, really base level, because at the end of the day, music therapy is about people, and it's about helping support people, and it's about just, I guess, trying to find and make it as accessible as we can. So trying to, you know, we have actually a very diverse sort of clientele within the UK, you know, and I think that's something that we should really kind of celebrate and maybe make a bigger thing of. But it's very hard, again, because of the stigma of therapy, for people to talk about it. So for me, there's something about, you know, even getting into schools or getting into community centres and just talking to people and just saying, you know, look, we're here. Just use us, we're here. So I think there's lots of ways to go about it, but I think for me, starting almost kind of at the top of the hierarchy. I hate that we have a hierarchy. I don't really like that word, but that is what we have, unfortunately. But yeah, starting at the top and at the bottom to meet these people just where they're at is really, really important.
Let's take a hypothetical person, a hypothetical client almost. For example, someone with dementia, how they would go from suffering to communicate, perhaps not being understood as much, being on the sort of cusp of society, not really able to integrate themselves because of their lack of communication. How that process really leads them to perhaps be more confident, to reintroduce those memories, for example, that we were discussing earlier with old songs and so on. So could you sort of give me an idea of a hypothetical scenario or a hypothetical therapeutic session that would help with that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually reminded me of Vicky McClure did a BBC documentary about music in dementia care homes, and she went and sat in on a music therapy session and captured this absolutely wonderful clip, which really sums up kind of what we're thinking about. So in that clip, what happened was there was a lady who had quite advanced dementia who was really struggling to interact, and you know that if you've had family members or you've kind of seen people in the advanced stages of dementia, that they can go very kind of inward, and it can be very, very isolating. And there's a lot of concerns about quality of life, and there's a lot of concerns about obviously agitation and things like that. And unfortunately, often they have to have kind of increased pharmaceutical interventions to help manage the agitation, and that has side effects. So it's a really, really difficult stage of life for that person, but also for their family members around them as well. And in those instances, and what was really demonstrated in this clip was just how much familiar music can almost sort of help bring that person outwards again. And the way that works is, as I kind of mentioned before, is when we listen to familiar music, what happens in our brains is that basically the more we listen to it, the more our brain works out the predicted patterns. So it's like, if you're at a club, you know when that beat's going to drop if you know the song, and it's because our brains just love pattern and love repetition. So the more we repeat and listen to things, the more the brain thinks, right, I know where this is going, I know this predicted pattern. But at the same time, your brain assigns an autobiographical memory to it. So the way I always think of this is like when you're driving to work and you hear, like for me, maybe it's a Spice Girls song on the radio, and I am literally transported back to 10 years old, dancing with my friends in the playground. And it's amazing that just hearing that music brings back this memory. And we all have it. So even in the advanced stages of dementia, our brains still react like that. So once someone hears that song, it can almost kind of give them this little sort of transport back to this hopefully happy memory, because we have to acknowledge that often, although those moments are lovely when they're positive, songs can also hold kind of difficult memories for us as well. So that's why it's quite important in these instances to have someone like a music therapist who's trained to help support you in those positive and negative times. But yeah, so basically what will happen is that the therapist will start singing a familiar song, and the person might start joining in. And often if it's a positive thing, again, if you're thinking about that music has an effect on your heart rate, it can affect our systolic blood pressure. So, if it's a really upbeat song, like when we go to the gym and we listen to upbeat music to get us pumping and going, it can really kind of make us energized, but also it can relax us. So, it's again kind of thinking about how do you meet that person with dementia in that moment and just sort of support them. So there's lots and lots of different kind of aspects to it. And in the clip that I was just talking about from that BBC documentary, what happened was the woman kind of really sat up and she started sort of playing instruments with the music therapist, and she'd come in the room and just sort of sat down and just looked very inward. So music's very, very powerful. And there's lots of evidence now for dementia work in kind of helping people access memories, but also just kind of giving them that space in which they can just be themselves and be heard and be supported.
You said that previous songs, perhaps old songs or songs that are linked to certain memories, are quite beneficial. But as I understand it, again, correct me if I'm wrong, improvised music is quite important in music therapy as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the UK, perhaps compared to, I know that sort of in the US, improvisation is used, but perhaps not quite to the same extent. But in the UK, a big part of our trainings is really about improvised music and how to use it. And that becomes really about kind of breaking music down into its elements. So it's thinking about, pitch or rhythm and thinking about them kind of almost separately, and then when you put them together, how can I help meet this person? Am I going to use pitch? Am I going to use rhythm? Am I going to try and, perhaps you've got a young child who is actually just really mobile and just constantly going around the room and really difficult to gauge. So as a music therapist, I might actually be immobile, just stay in one place and think, right, I'm going to try and use rhythm to really try and just ground this person and sort of help contain this energy that I can kind of feel from them. But yeah, so there's lots of perspectives about how improvisation works and what goes on. So my personal perspective, and from my practice, is that I really feel that when you engage in improvisation, whatever is going on for you under the surface and whatever is kind of sitting in your subconscious really comes out, because you're giving yourself an outlet to express yourself. And often, it can maybe be those feelings that you weren't really aware before you were feeling. So I've had people who've sort of come in and who seem calm, and maybe we've said a quick hello and we've had a chat and they seem quite docile, and then we start playing and the music is loud and it's intense. And actually afterwards it can, it might seem like a bit of a cathartic release. It might be that they realise in themselves that actually they're holding a lot in. It can lead to so many things. So, but yeah, improvisation, which is basically just you have instruments out and you invite someone to come in and just play whatever they feel drawn to. And this is the thing that can be quite tricky for some people, I think particularly adults, because they have often adult clients come in with this perception that they're not good at music. And it's always linked to kind of what happens at music at school. Maybe they weren't allowed to sing in a choir or be part of a band, and they think, oh no, I can't play, I'm not musical, I'm not good enough. But it's not about that. There's no right or wrong in improvisation. It's just pure expression and interaction with your therapist. It's a really, really powerful tool.
And as far as I understand it as well, it's almost, from what I've read on the subject, it's almost a way to increase that individual aspect of the therapy instead of necessarily relying upon a radio station or some sort of album, for example. I was quite curious as to ask about really the stigmas that we were talking about with therapy. Speaking from a personal aspect, I don't really see a problem with therapy as a whole. I'm in the mindset of, if you need help and there's avenues that you can receive help, fantastic, right? I just wanted to know from your experience, have you come across people, maybe in your personal life, maybe from your family, maybe from people that you've come across that have approached BAMT? Has anyone sort of confronted you and said, this is rubbish, I don't believe in this, I don't think this actually works? Music, really? I mean, is there, I understand perhaps the stigma of therapy is a more global issue, but has there been any moments from you where you felt or confronted with conflict against the idea and practice of music therapy?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think a lot of us in the profession have come across that quite a lot. And it's again just that lack of understanding about the profession. I've experienced that, like you say, kind of from sort of family members, family friends who are perhaps of the older generation. But interestingly, I have also experienced it in places where I've worked from other colleagues. And that is something that unfortunately does happen more than we would perhaps like, where basically it is that I've not heard of music therapy, and unfortunately, and I'm really generalising here because this isn't exclusively kind of a medical problem, but a lot of the time where I've heard about it and where I've experienced it has been more in those medical settings where everything is very driven by outcomes and very, it's all about kind of, well, we do X, Y, and Z and we monitor this and then this is what we want to happen. And unfortunately, and I think this is true of all therapy, but, music therapy as well, it's a process. And as wonderful as it would be to be like, oh yes, if you have, 4 sessions of music therapy, we'll have sorted out X, Y, and Z. But music therapy isn't about fixing. This is perhaps part of the problem. Sorry, my dog's decided to come join us now. So unfortunately, you do get that from sort of colleagues as well. And I think it is just about understanding, and it is just about these different models of working, and sometimes it's hard to make music therapy fit into a model because actually it's so personal, and it's, like we said before, it's so bespoke. And a lot of it is really, I think some of the more powerful things that you see or hear about music therapy is when it's come from the service user themselves, either talking about it or like these clips that we've talked about as well. There's a real power for kind of when you see and hear it, but from the outside, that can often be quite hard. And I think that's something that partly as a profession we need to work on. We need to work on perhaps the language we use and how we talk about the processes that take place. And I think when you're working in different types of institutions, you almost have to be able to speak a different language, because if people are writing, let's say you're in schools and they're writing EHC plans, they're going to use a particular kind of language, they're going to be using a particular kind of assessment, and you have to really kind of try and fit in or just make what you do almost kind of, fit this language. And it's the same in medical settings. Obviously, you see that quite a lot, because it's quite advanced sort of vocabulary when we're talking about all these different medical conditions, and how do you then put music into that language? So there's still a lot of work to be done, but you definitely do see and hear of a lot of kind of almost sort of discrimination in that way. So more work to be done.
So if you could say any sort of future predictions or any sort of future expectations of the practice of music therapy, do you see more people, the stigma of therapy as a whole, breaking down? Do you see more young people being interested in the profession and taking it up as a career? From BAMT, do you see more engagement perhaps, or even less? I'm just sort of wondering over your time and your experience, not just in BAMT, but obviously with your studies and so on. Have you seen any sort of trends and correlations surrounding music therapy?
I think on the whole, we do seem to have more people trying to train. There's definitely we have more training courses than we did, 10 years ago. I think, though, unfortunately, and this is just my personal opinion, that it's still an awful lottery in the UK, and it really depends a lot on where you are based in the UK and what the funding is like. And unfortunately, a lot of it does end up coming down to funding, and access to therapy is very much driven by access to funding. And as great as it is that, there's been all this talk about social prescribing and that music therapy could maybe play a greater role in that, there's again a big question about, well, who's going to fund that? And, how are we going to get people, how are we going to get access to that? How are we going to get clients to get access to that? So I would like to think on the whole, we'll keep getting bigger and stronger, because I think the more of us there are, then hopefully the greater voice we'll have. But I think we really do need to look as a profession. But I mean, this really goes up to this covers kind of quite a lot within the healthcare system and all these other systems. Like, we really have to look at how do we kind of level the playing field a bit, and we've got music therapists who work in very, very rural parts of the country. So again, thinking about, well, how can we support them better, and how can we again improve access to therapy there, and the funding from local authority to local authority is incredibly sparse compared to perhaps what it used to be. We've gone through a long period of a lot of cuts, and so it has just become a bit of a mishmash, unfortunately. So for me, I think something that I personally would love to be able to address and work towards addressing is, how do we make therapy accessible to everyone, and how do we make access to jobs for new therapists accessible to everyone? Because again, if you are, it's not even true for every big city, but if you're part of a big city or close to a big city, perhaps you have a little bit more guarantee of work than other places. And that's because we have a real mismatch of self-employed and sort of permanent contracted members. And again, it just really depends where you are and how the setup is with local schools, local authorities, local community centres. So it's a very mixed picture. And I think we need to really address that. If we're going to make the profession bigger and stronger, we need to address that, and we need to get more NHS posts. We need to get more salaried posts, rather than this kind of funny system we have where people are sort of contracted in, and if the work disappears overnight because of COVID or anything else, then it's not very stable for everyone. So I think there's a lot for us to do in terms of trying to develop that career framework. But to do that, we need to have support from the government. We need to have support from NHS bodies. It's there's only so much that we can do and we can kind of shout for. We need to really just get that recognition from others. So we've still got a fight to fight.
Definitely. You brought up COVID, and that was really my last question. I just wanted to know, how really has the pandemic, I guess you can mostly speak from BAMT's point of view, but I mean, from if you've noticed any sort of, again, trends and occurrences across music therapy in the UK, has it really encouraged that instability and almost grey area that you were talking about in terms of jobs and who's employed and who really loses their jobs overnight type of thing? Or is there a bigger impact that the pandemic has had on the industry?
Yeah, I think it is twofold. I think it, like a lot of sectors, and particularly the arts sector, actually, I think a lot of work did disappear very quickly. What has been absolutely inspiring and totally phenomenal about this pandemic, though, is how much the profession has rallied around, and we've really kind of unified, I think. So historically, there'd be different organisations kind of doing different things, and what we've really seen at BAMT is that actually all these big organisations spread throughout the UK, they really come together and everyone is talking and sharing ideas and sharing resources and sharing support. And that's been for me, I found that really inspiring, because one of the things I love about this profession is how passionate music therapists are about their work. And I've yet to meet a music therapist who doesn't try and fly the flag for their clients or for the profession, and we're an incredibly passionate sort of bunch of people. And the other really intriguing thing is that I honestly think a month before the pandemic, if you had turned around to our profession and said, do you know what, could we try doing music therapy online? Could we try doing a therapy session on Zoom? I honestly think you would have been just shouted down, and people would have been like, don't be ridiculous, like there's no way that can work. And yet, when forced to, there's been huge swathes of music therapists providing online provision, providing free resource packs to families, providing, continuing one-to-one work, continuing to build those relationships, offering group work. There's been some fantastic posts in the BBC. There was a great dementia and Alzheimer's project called Homeside, and they were able to continue providing this music therapy group for these sort of older people and their carers. So they didn't lose that sense of community, and they could still see other members, which is just incredible. So I think that while, yes, it will have had an impact on jobs, I think that actually, in a way, we're coming out stronger than we were before. We have unified so much more, and we're also really kind of being innovative with our practice. And that's something that I think can only add strength to us, really.
Bringing up how you were saying about music therapists accessing and really utilising the technological tools that we have around us that are kind of necessary during the pandemic, a question that I did have was, how did music therapy really react to implementations and advances within technology, not just because of the pandemic and how popular Zoom, for example, has become, but also for outlets of using tools and instruments, for example, and even therapy as a practice in itself obviously would need tools that assist with that profession. So I just wanted to really know how technology really played a part in music therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really interesting aspect of music therapy, and I think it's one that we're still continuing to really kind of develop and grow. But yeah, I think with the development of sort of tablets and iPads and these apps where actually you could create music literally with the touch of a finger, I think it's really opened up a huge amount of possibilities. And I know that there are music therapists who really utilize that technology, particularly with clients who have such limited movement, because obviously if you are using like what's called sort of traditional sort of instruments, maybe percussion instruments, if you've got someone that can only kind of move a finger, you're really limited in kind of the sounds that you can give them to kind of interact with. But if you have an iPad and they can move their finger, there's so many different apps that you can use where actually that person could play, just more than a single note, and could have a little bit more autonomy, perhaps if they're able to have that kind of control of their movement and all these wonderful things. So I think there's kind of that side to it, which is great, and it's definitely an area that I think it's an area to watch. I'd like to think that's something that is going to become much, much bigger as well as time goes on. But I think on the other side, there's definitely much more about streaming music as well. And again, it kind of touches on that sort of familiar music that we've already talked about. But I know of music therapists who work with clients using playlists, which is really interesting, and using it to help emotional regulation. And it's something that I've done in my work as well. And it's really about identifying, what are the kind of responses, emotional responses we have to different types of music, and then actually highlighting, okay, well, maybe if I'm getting into, let's say someone with mental health difficulties, if I'm getting to a kind of low place, but actually I'm okay, but I just need to kind of express that, maybe having a playlist of music that's kind of leaves them in that kind of ambient feeling, but it's not going to push their mood further down. And then, having a separate playlist for actually I can feel myself kind of really going downhill. I need something that's going to help lift me. Having quite a specific playlist for that. So that's another really interesting side, because again, music and recorded music and live music is so much more accessible than it's ever been before. So it's definitely a really intriguing area, and one that I think we need to explore and research much, much more, and hopefully continue to, as all these new kind of technologies come out, hopefully be able to kind of utilize them and explore them much more.